Hey everybody, hope you're doing well this week. Got 2 more weeks of the semester left, so let's see how much we can get done in those 2 weeks. Last week you watched a video and did some work related to adaptations of grasses, and so this week I'm going to talk about grassland ecosystems. So what I've done in this slide presentation is I've gone through and annotated the slides and provided some additional information as text. And so I'm going to try to go through this presentation fairly quickly. And in order to do the quiz and get all the material, you'll kind of have to go through a little bit slower and read some of those slides where I've added text. So ultimately, where I've added more text to the slides, I'll try not to say very much now with the goal of keeping this relatively short. So let's get moving. Sorry, I didn't realize this was so kind of pixelated and blurry. But when I'm talking about grasslands in the U.S., I'm really going to be talking about the Great Plains or the Central Great Plains in the U.S., which is kind of shown here as this orange area in the center of the continent. We also have like desert grasslands and we have annual grasslands in California, but I'm not going to talk about those in this lecture. Here's just a map map of the United States showing the woody cover. And so this is kind of cool because you can see this Central Great Plains and the western part of the lowland plains here, where it's almost completely devoid of trees or woody vegetation. And so that's the region we're going to focus on today. We talked a little bit about disturbances last week and the disturbances that grasses are best adapted to. And so I'll kind of talk about those different disturbances throughout. Maybe I'll focus on one of them more in a certain type of grassland than the others, but kind of be thinking about those three disturbances across the grasslands that I'm going to talk about today. And so we have three broad categories of grasslands in the Central Great Plains. We have the short grass prairie, which is on the western side of the Great Plains, the mixed grass prairie or the mixed prairie, and the tall grass prairie on the eastern side. And so these are the three I'll focus on. Again, there are a couple other grassland types in the US, but we won't focus on those now because these three are really the dominant ones as far as land mass that they're covering. And we will talk about desert grasslands briefly in the desert ecosystem section next week. And the gradient between these three grasslands matches the gradient in precipitation really well. So here's just a precipitation map we've looked at several times. And so if you look kind of just on the east side of the Rocky Mountains here, which is kind of in eastern, it's in eastern Colorado and eastern Wyoming, eastern Montana, and so on and so forth. We have fairly dry conditions, and the amount of precip that an area receives increases as you move towards the east. And the reason for that is as most of our air patterns are moving from the western U.S. to the eastern U.S., and as those air masses move across that area, transpiration from the plants is adding moisture to the air. And so that moisture, as it kind of fills up the capacity of the air to hold moisture, it'll start raining more and more frequently the further east you get. So it's really the transpiration from the plants in the west that actually add moisture to the air that is dropped out on the land masses more towards the east, giving it more higher precip, and that's where our tall grass prairies are. Okay, so we'll start out talking about mixed grass prairies. I'm going to keep this relatively short because these are really intermediate between the tall and the short grass prairies. There's a couple slides here just kind of showing that the mixed grass prairies are in this transition between where crops are dominant and where range is dominant, and it's that transition zone between those. I've got some slides on the climate. I'll let you look at these a little bit more. The thing to note here is that most of the precip is coming in the spring and kind of falls off later in the growing season, and so we get some kind of moderate drought conditions in the mixed grass prairies. You're going to need to compare the ANPPs between these three grasslands, so I have a slide on that for each of the grassland types. And so the takeaways from the mixed grass prairie here are that it's a little more productive than shortgrass prairie. So it's got more intensive agriculture than the shortgrass prairie, especially kind of in the northern parts where it's moderate temperatures and relatively high precip. And then grazing management is especially important in the mixed grass prairie because it's kind of sensitive to how much grazing there is and what species are going to be present on the landscape. So there's a couple slides here showing some actual data for the mixed grass prairie and grazing intensity. And so I want you to take a look at that and see how grazing intensity affects the identity of the species on the landscape. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for mixed grass prairies, mainly because, again, it's really an intermediate between tall grass and short grass. There's been lots of studies across the central Great Plains, and the mixed grass prairie always is right in between the tall grass and the short grass. So the things we can learn on the mixed and the tall, or sorry, on the short and the tall grass, you can kind of assume for the most part that the mixed grass prairie is somewhere in between. And that I realize that kind of like is minimizing the importance of the mixed grass prairie, and I don't mean to do that. Just to maximize our time, I'm skipping it a little bit this year. Okay, let's move on to the tall grass prairie. Again, I've got some slides on the climate that you can look at. Main takeaway here is that there's a decent amount of precip and it comes during the growing season. And so the tall grass prairies are really on the edge of where we expect forests to show up. They have a decent amount of precip, and so lots of these areas could actually support forests if there weren't some disturbances. So if you go back to last week, there was a figure showing kind of the effect of precipitation amount, seasonality of drought, and disturbance frequency, and how those three factors control the distribution of grasslands, savannas, and forests. And so tallgrass prairie is really on that verge between going to a savanna ecosystem or potentially even a forest ecosystem. I'll just mention the flora very quickly. For the tallgrass, I don't talk about it for the other grasslands very much. But the reason I'll mention it here is because it's kind of unique in that much of the tallgrass prairie is dominated by these four species that are sometimes referred to as the big four. All four of these species are C4 species. That means they utilize C4 photosynthesis. And you find them dominating the tallgrass prairie from as far north as it goes to as far south. So remember the big four and the fact that they're all C4. Also thinking about flora, we have these gallery forests that are in the riparian zones. And so that's really the only place we expect to find trees in the tallgrass prairie. Although these areas, these gallery forests are starting to expand and kind of move up into the watersheds. So if you look in this picture in the bottom right, the picture is taken from a fairly high vantage point looking down. And so these gallery forests are kind of encroaching up out of the watersheds onto the ridge tops. And so most of that is probably due to fire suppression, but there's some uncertainty about the exact mechanisms for the expansion. Sorry, I'm not talking very clearly this morning. Okay, just a brief comment on fire, and I'll come back to this when we talk about the shortgrass prairie. But we think historically that the return interval was somewhere between every 3 and 4 years in the tallgrass prairie that a large fire would come through. And just so here's some images of fires burning the tallgrass prairie. So here's a watershed in the tallgrass prairie that has not been burned for over 4 years. And so this is what happens when you don't have frequent enough fires, is that you get a lot of these woody species growing into what used to be dominated by grasslands. So this just kind of highlights the importance of that, the frequency of the disturbance in grassland ecosystems. This is another picture from the same general area, but it's kind of nice because if you can kind of see this road or 2-track running through the middle, it divides this watershed into 2 treatments. The treatment on the right, which is clearly dominated by herbaceous plants, is burned every year, and the watershed that's on the left, or the section of the watershed on the left, is burned every 20 years. And so Lots of the brown patches are a woody species that hasn't greened up yet. And actually a lot of this green stuff in the middle is dogwood, which is a shrub. So big differences in vegetation with changes in fire frequency. In the tall grass, kind of think about this in 3 different regions: the northern region, a central, and then the Flint Hill regions. And so I'll say just a couple words about each one. The northern region is kind of generally highlighted in the area in this red circle, but we're kind of thinking about the western edge of Minnesota and Iowa, and the eastern side of South Dakota and North Dakota is kind of this northern tallgrass prairie. Much of this region is part of what is referred to as Lake Agassiz. So Lake Agassiz no longer exists. It occurred and existed when the glaciers were starting to recede from the US back up towards Canada. And as that glacier was receding, it created this wall. And the land up in the north is sloping toward the north. And so it was sloping towards the glaciers as it receded. And so all of that ice melt just accumulated as a large lake. And while that lake was present, all the sediment that was in that lake was deposited on that landscape. And so the soils in the north are really very high quality, fine soils that hold lots of moisture. And so it's a really productive area. Unfortunately, it's also really prone to flooding because of the way it's sloped in the types of soils it has. These are pictures of a couple major flood events that have occurred over the last 20 years or so in the area. And so it seems to be a fairly cyclical thing where they have these major flood events. But productivity in this area is limited by temperatures because you're so far north, it's relatively cold. And so there's definitely some agriculture in this area, but not as much. And so some of these tallgrass prairies are still intact in this region. Those are just, here's the central tallgrass prairie. Also used to be covered in glaciers. And so the area is relatively flat, but also has fairly deep, fine and fertile soils. And so much of the central tall grasslands has been converted to agriculture. So here's just kind of a map of what we consider the Midwest Corn Belt. And so this central part, and you can see parts of the northern tallgrass prairie kind of make up a large part of this corn belt. And so they're really productive, really important for food production, but that pressure to grow, row crop agriculture has resulted in a loss of a lot of the tallgrass prairie. Then the last area is the Flint Hills, which is highlighted here in green. It comprises much of kind of this eastern portion of Kansas and the northern part of Oklahoma. This area was part of the inland sea, and it kind of, as the inland sea receded and expanded, it deposited different soil types. And so we have these limestone layers that actually makes the soils here fairly shallow and difficult for agriculture. And so this area represents kind of the best examples of native tallgrass prairie that we have in the United States. All right, so here's some summaries of the tallgrass prairie. Just current land usage, and if you look closely here, you can see there's very little tallgrass prairie left. It's mostly cropland. Okay, let's move on to the shortgrass real quick. Again, I'm expecting you to kind of go through these slides and read through the text that I've added in more detail. But now we're talking about the western edge of the Central Great Plains. So here's just a couple images from just northeast of Fort Collins. It's referred to as the Central Plains Experimental Range, and it's managed by the USDA. And this is where much of the research and much of our understanding of the shortgrass steppe comes from, just because there's been so much research focused in this area. And so just here's a map of where it's located if you're interested. It's part of the Pawnee National Grassland, and there's lots of hiking trails out there if you're interested in seeing what the shortgrass prairie looks like. All right, slide again on climate. Another slide just highlighting the fact that this part of the grassland, so the shortgrass prairie, is prone to droughts, and so that's a really important part of shaping the shortgrass steppe. The other important thing about the precipitation of the shortgrass steppe is that it's driven by these small rain events. So, it gets a large number of rain events every year, but most of them are really small and actually contribute very little to the functioning of the ecosystem. And so I want you to look through these slides a little bit. There's some questions on the quiz, or a question on the quiz associated with this, and kind of the distribution of rain event size and amount of rain that you need to get from these slides. Okay, slide on productivity. Just a brief comment about the flora is that the most successful species are short-statured and drought-tolerant, and it turns out that these things go together, at least in this ecosystem. So the grasses that are the shortest, they tend to be the most grazing resistant just because it's harder for cattle to utilize them. They also happen to be the most drought-tolerant. And so both of those kind of stress tolerance mechanisms occur in the same plants. And so really what we have is one or two species that really dominate the shortgrass steppe, and those are the ones that, again, are short-statured and really drought-tolerant. Just another mention about the fire frequency. So fires, as we talked about last week with that kind of disturbance frequency component, that fires are important to maintaining grassland structure, or the structure of the plant communities. But I do want to point out that in the shortgrass steppe, fires are a lot less common than they are in the tallgrass. And so I just want to talk about this for a second. This conceptual figure I've drawn on the left is what we would expect if we will look across all ecosystems, from deserts to tropical rainforest. We'd expect that as you get higher amounts of precip, so as MAP increases, fire frequency decreases. And so this is the general pattern we think of when we think of precip and fires. And that's because the more precip you have, the less dry the ecosystems are, the less likely they are to ignite and carry fires. But within there's some details that you need to be aware of. In grasslands, it's actually the exact opposite relationship. The grasslands that occur in the wetter areas, so the tallgrass prairies, for example, burn more frequently than those in drier places like the shortgrass prairie. And it's mainly a fuel load issue. There's not enough fuel in the shortgrass prairie to really carry a fire very well, and so we don't see these kind of large prairie or large fires very frequently in the shortgrass prairie. But in the tallgrass, it's dry enough that you can get ignition, and the fuel can be dry enough to carry fires. But there's also enough fuel there to really, make that a common occurrence. Just a couple things about the land use in this area. There's a lot of it that's grazed instead of agriculture, so you see a larger proportion of agriculture or crop agriculture in the mixed and tallgrass prairies. But in the shortgrass, it's dominated by ranches and rangeland ecosystems, with about 40% being in crops. And then I put some acronyms here, so I thought I changed those, and apparently I didn't. So the SGS, which is the shortgrass steppe, and the NMP, which is the northern mixed prairies, those are the two regions that have the largest areas of native grassland remaining. And that's mainly because crop agriculture is not as viable as an income source in those areas. And so they've been grazed more than anything and never plowed. And the fact that there's grazers there mimics the historic grazing that was there by wild grazers. And so those ecosystems look a lot like we think they did pre-European settlement and pre kind of written and verbal history passed down through cultures that have lived in this region for a long time. Okay, that's as quick as I can do it. Here's the summary of precip and AMPP that you kind of need to be familiar with. Please take a little bit more time reading those slides. The questions on the quiz, some of those questions will be more related to the text on there than what I just said, so you'll need to pay more attention to that. All right, good luck, and hope all is well.